Alice?
Morning.
Yeah. Alrighty, let's get started. We're looking at the Gospel of John. We're in our third week this morning. And first of all, let's just start out by reviewing what we've looked at in the first 5 verses of the prologue, which is the first chapter of John. And I'm interpreting this, my view of this is that John is employing a authorship device that was common at the day. It eventually was formally labeled as Midrashic interpretation, and what that is where the Jewish scholars of the time, and even more so as time went on into the New Testament era, is that the text of the Old Testament, of course, that was there and part of their experience, had to be interpreted. And so Midrashic interpretive method was to take the text primarily of the law, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and to retell those stories in the sense of bringing them into the current culture as culture kept moving along, bringing meaning to the current audience. And I think, this is my view, right or wrong. This is how I'm thinking John employed that same method in retelling the story out of Genesis chapter 1. You know, your first reading, you look at, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, in my view, the position I'm taking is that John is looking back, going back to that text and retelling that text and saying, well, in the beginning was the Word. And retelling that, and this is how some of the details of that is that, and as he's building his prologue, I'm looking at it as a storyteller in movements of a story. So line 1, John is saying, in the beginning was the Word. Well, he's retelling, in my view, Genesis chapter 1, saying that in the beginning there were 2 powers in heaven. There's a relationship within the Godhead. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it's shown from the very beginning that in the Godhead there is a relationship. He was in the beginning with God. And then we go to movement number 2. All things came into being through Him, that is the Word. And apart from Him, the Word, nothing came into being that has come into being. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And so now the second movement is showing the role of the Word. The role of the Word is He is the creative agent, and not only agent, but sustainer, and the relational aspect, in relationally bringing the Godhead in relation to all of creation. That in Him was life, and the life was the light of men. There is a connection now. So now in two verses, John has made the connection of the Word, 2 powers in heaven of equal and oneness relationship, and extending that Godhead entity into all of creation, not standing at arm's distance, but actually engaged within creation. In Him is life, and that life is the light of men. Now, the third movement, things change. The story is set in two movements. But then, as we talked about last week, movement 3 is the conflict within the story, the problem to be solved. Just like in any storytelling, sets the scene, but, and here, this is how I'm interpreting verse 5. The light shines into the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. That is the conflict that needs to be resolved, and that will be resolved in the telling of His gospel. Again, this is all my opinion. And we spent a great deal of time last week looking at that. What does that mean? it can mean one of two things. Either the light cannot overcome, the darkness cannot overcome the light, or the darkness does not understand the light. And I'm taking the latter position, is that in the very beginning, as I talked about last week, is in the beginning, in the creation of all things, the light the darkness yielded to the light. God said, "Let there be light," and the light vanished, and there was light. So I'm thinking that there is a second darkness that is there, and that is what is depicted in Genesis chapter 3. And that from that point on, the light or the darkness cannot understand the light. It cannot grasp it. And so that's my position. So what is new, we're going to go back to this a little bit, but the new text is, there came a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, at first reading, you go, God, where? He's in Genesis. Now, what about John the Baptist? Well, how does this fit in? Whose name is John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. So here is, again, in my opinion, John employing the midrashic the method of interpretation, and he now, looking back to Genesis, he now takes that story, he's retold it now in light of the Word, and he fast forwards to the now, bringing that story right into the realm of the current culture at the time. At the time that he wrote this, in the 90s, it was the last gospel. We'll be looking at that as a comparison in the next couple of weeks. But John the Baptist was a well-known entity. He was gone. He'd been gone for over 50 years. But his ministry was well known. His audience, John's audience, would have known about John the Baptist. In a similar way, it would be like, I was trying to think about how could I illustrate this? And so I took the period of time between when John wrote and when John the Apostle and John the Baptist lived, and I came up with this story. In the 1960s, the world was under what was called the Cold War, and there was a great threat of nuclear disaster. Of course, that was prompted by America bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that these weapons of mass destructions, they call nuclear arms, were escalating. And in the 60s, there was fear between the two powers of Russia and the United States. And I can remember as a young student in school, we had training. Remember that, when we had training to crawl under your desk if there was an atomic bomb that went off. Now, the whole thing is funny, actually. Crawling under your desk if an atomic bomb, but we had drills where we had to crawl under our desk. You guys remember that?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Bomb shelter.
Well, the whole thing, what happened is, Russia and the United States were building these arms, and it was kind of prompted by the U.S. setting up arms in nuclear ballistic missiles in Italy and Turkey, and Russia found out about that, and they cut a deal with Cuba, and they set up ballistic missiles in Cuba. Well, one day the U.S. had a spy plane flying over Cuba and saw the missile silos and saw these missiles in Cuba, and that's what prompted what was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was a 13-day, it was the closest that we have ever come up to now, closest that we have ever come in history to a nuclear war. Now, there's that story. And there came a man named John F. Kennedy. You see how I put John F. Kennedy into that story? And he was able to between the Kremlin and the White House, they were able to negotiate that whole crisis out in that 13-day crisis. You guys remember that crisis?
I
Well-
was in that blockade.
Yeah.
What's that?
I was in the Cuban blockade.
Wow, no kidding.
Yeah.
You were there.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. So I'm telling that as a story very quickly, simply to put what John is doing in context, because he's setting this stage for his story of the gospel, and he fast forwards it to today, and he puts within the audience's reach John the Baptist, who they would all be familiar with, and the role that he will play. John plays a significant role here. So that's how I see this. I don't see it as a disjointed intrusion into the story. It's part of the story, and it's the way he's telling this story, or retelling the story. Then he goes on, and he says, there was a true light which coming into the world. Now our heads automatically, because we're New Testament guys, we go, oh, that's Jesus. Well, okay, just bear with me. I don't think he's there yet, but that's my opinion. This light, which is the Word, this light was present in the world, coming into the world. And this Word enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. Just like he said up here, or in verse 1. Those who were his own did not receive him, but as many as did receive him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. Now, that verse has been applied to Jesus Christ, our whole lives. That's how, and it's not wrong. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I think John is not referring to Jesus Christ yet. He's referring to the Word. And the Word is present within the world, and the Word is there reaching out into the darkness. And that's how I'm interpreting. And he says, but there were those who, any of those who received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. There is a God action taking place throughout all of history that are bringing bringing the present to bring people to God in relationship. And I'm interpreting that as primarily through the Word. Okay, so that's John 1, 6 through 13. It's going to set us up for what happens in verse 14 that we're not going to look at today. So, by way of review, we looked at last week, Genesis chapter 3. We're looking back because John is looking back, in my mind. Another voice enters the scene, okay? In Genesis 3, offering a counter proposal. We know the story. We know what happened, that this separation took place. The man and the woman embraced the voice of the serpent, and a separation took place. We see it. They clothed themselves. Something changed. And this term is what the biblical term is death. Separation and death are I see them as closely correlated, if not the same thing, in my head. Death and separation. Not death and separation. Death and separation, in my mind, are exactly the same thing.
No blindness?
What's that?
And now blindness?
Yeah. Yeah, and so what happens as a result is that's the second darkness. The darkness returns once again. It was driven out in chapters 1 and 2, but now it returns to the world. The darkness returns. And I think that's what John is referring to. So, now we move on. And I'd like somebody prepared to read Genesis 4, 1 through 15, because I want to read this story. We've looked at chapter 3. Now, to get a handle on the setting of John's gospel through the prologue, we're going to continue on to look at this idea of the separation and how it escalated throughout the world. Yes.
Tell me that's not me. I can't read
It's because it's dark.
Okay.
Yeah, so. Okay, I'll read it to you, okay? So could someone get ready to read 4, 1 through 15? And so where Genesis 4 fits in is, of course, right after 3. And I don't think it was just a story plopped in there. It's to give us insight, direct insight of what death looks like. Genesis 3 is where it was introduced. Genesis 4 is then at a family level what it looks like, okay? At the very rudimentary base. And so this separation extended to the next generation, expressing itself, first of all, through, there's 3 key words here we're going to look at. This is really primary to what our look at John is going to look like. 3 key words: comparison, resistance, and dominance. And those 3 terms are apparent in chapter 4. We're going to read the text. So why don't we read the text and then I'll activate the slide. Somebody want to read 4, 1 through 15.
Now Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I've gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock, and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. The Lord said to Cain, Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it. Cain spoke to Abel his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, Where's Abel your brother? He said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the Lord said, What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And now you are cursing from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord said to him, Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mask on Cain, lest any who found him should attack him.
Yeah, man, fascinating story. So, what again I think is Genesis 4 is beginning to see what this epidemic is going to develop into. This epidemic of separation. First of all, there are 2 brothers. And the 2 brothers, one is doing one thing and one is doing another. And they both have a relationship with God, interacting. And one brother gets really upset because God likes the other best in his mind. Okay, there is comparison, is where Cain sees his brother and how God interacts with his brother, Abel, and it sets up, he puts himself one notch out. And that is separate, that is comparison. That's the first thing. Then when God, out of his grace, says to Cain, what is up with you? You know, all you have to do is what is right. Now notice because we interpret back from in our New Testament way of thinking, we say, well, obviously he should have sacrificed an animal. He was in the wrong business. You know, he raised crops. There is no mention here of the animal. It is if you do what is right, you can work through this. It's addressing this inner drive of this comparison, the same thing that happened in chapter 3, and this drive to get even. And he says, he gives him an offering. If you do what's right, if not, sin is crouching at the door. This propensity, this drive inside of you, Cain, if you don't overpower it, it's going to get the best of you, and it will result in outward sin. Okay? Sin is following. It's crouching at the door. Well, he didn't. He resisted, the next word, he didn't take the counsel of God. God speaking to him directly, and he didn't take the counsel. And as a result, that anger grew, that resistance to God, and the anger grew to a point where I will take control and I will dominate my brother. And he killed his brother. And there is dominance. So I see 3 key things that occurred. And here is an illustration. And I know it's difficult because we're in the dark here. So, but what I'm showing here is this, through this illustration, is a relationship. The human condition, naturally relationships tend to separate through this thing of comparison. We go through life and we're always profiling relationships, and that leads to a separation. Sooner or later in relationships, there is a conflict. They come together. One dominates. One wins. And that one goes on, and the other one is nullified or destroyed. That, in a very primal sense, is the condition that is resulted from what occurred in Genesis chapter 3. And those 3 words are comparison here, where we're driving a wedge, moving further and further apart in relationships naturally. And then there is resistance when asked by God, when counseled by God Almighty, you don't have to live this way, Cain. That's my words. He says you're going to shoot yourself in the foot, but we don't listen. We resist. And that is part of the human condition. We resist. And then as a result, what finally happens is that the 2 brothers come together. One has to dominate and kills the other. And so there you go. Comparison, resistance, and dominance are. So if you looked at it from a triangle sense, a flow chart, at the top is the word separation, Genesis chapter 3, with parentheses underneath, death. And then as that grows, what does that look like in chapter 4? Well, there are three key, I call them human propensities. And one is comparison, resistance, and dominance. And that is right here. And so what I've done with this idea is I've drawn a little symbol to illustrate, a little graphic, and we're going to see this symbol, these 3 symbols. The first one are 2 arrows that line up like this. You and I, because of our human condition and all of mankind, tend to profile relationships. And we're either higher or lower. And that affects how we feel and our actions with other people. So this comparison thing. That's what happened in Genesis 3. That's what happened primarily first movement in chapter 4. Then when we are confronted, when we are invited to change, we don't embrace counsel naturally, guys. We resist. We resist. That is part of our human condition. We resist. And that's what's depicted by the double line and the arrow, coming to a dead end. And then the last one, dominance, is that if we get opportunity, we as humans generally, we seek to dominate. we seek to crush. We want to come in from the top as in the power position and make a dent, make a dent in the world around us, dominance. And I view it that these three human propensities is what drives all sin. Just like God told Cain, if you don't deal with this, bud, sin is crouching at the door. So, what we see now is that the word continued to speak into the darkness, but the darkness could not grasp it. Again, I'm telling the story like I think John framed it in his head. Okay, so that's why we're doing all this. Is that his view of things? Is that the word was present. What John is calling the word was present in the world, speaking, going out, and being present, as we see in the text that we read this morning. But the world could not grasp it. And that's in verse 5. The light spoke into the darkness, and the darkness did not grasp it. Feel like your mouth is moving, so I can see you.
No, I'm just chewing on it.
Okay. Okay, however, from within the family, in 4, there came one. There was one who did not resist or compare or seek to dominate. There was one, this one, and his name, who was it? Enosh. His name was Enosh, and it says in verse... let's see. It says, verse 26, later on at the end of the chapter, Seth, there was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. Then began men, I got King James, then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. So there's this propensity, this darkness that's being spread throughout, but yet in the midst of the story, there's one who comes, and his name is Enosh. And there he is. There's Enosh. And Enosh's reception, he is one who received. He didn't resist. He received. And his reception, this is defined as, his reception of the word is defined as calling on the name of the Lord. Instead of resisting the word of the Lord, he's in parallel with the line, depicted by the two lines. Enosh is in parallel, in sync with receiving the word of God. Okay? So then, the story goes on. We're now in 5. Chapter 5, the generations of Adam. And it goes on. That story is the one where so-and-so lived and he died. And 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 you heard it. And so-and-so lived and he died. And then it gets right down into the text, and all of a sudden he comes to another guy, and he says, and so-and-so lived, and we expect, and he died. Wait, no. And he was not, for God took him. And right there, his word, a second, the word was received by Enoch. So there's Enosh, now there are two. The word is present, the word is speaking, and Enoch received that word. There he is. And Enoch's reception of the word is defined as walking with God. So we have one who is calling on the name of the Lord, and we have one who says he is walking with God. And they're one and the same because they are not in resistance to the Word of God. They are in parallel and receiving the Word of God. Okay? And again, I'm going back. This is how I think, in my feeble way, I think John is how he's framing the story that he's about to tell in John. So, thus far in chapter 5, this is setting the scene, guys. This is setting the scene for the Gospel of John. And notice what I have here in this graphic. At the end of Genesis chapter 5, what we have is this escalation of this propensity. And you can't see the detail, but I've got the little symbols there. The symbol of comparison, the symbol of resistance, and the symbol of dominance. And those three symbols dominate all of society and escalates to world proportions. And I'm calling this condition a jungle. It's a jungle. The world is now a jungle. And the jungle is typified by a place where there is abundant beauty and life and flourishing fruits and things of life and beauty. But on the other hand, in direct opposition, it is a place of brutal savageness and brutality that depicts in the jungle. There are things out there in the jungle that will kill you. But yet it's a beautiful place. It's a place that was wonderful to behold, but it's hard to navigate through. And that's why I'm calling the human condition on a global scale at the end of Genesis chapter 5 is a jungle. And those two depicting beauty and brutality coexisting together in one large, complex system, the jungle. Now, within the jungle, again, this is how I'm interpreting 1 through 5. In the jungle, wait, there's some light. The Word is present, and the Word is speaking in this jungle. And there are some, this guy over here, Enosh, he received the Word and is in parallel with the message of the Word and the life, who is the light of men. And then, secondly, there is yet another who comes in like manner. And his name is Enoch. And he's in the story. And he's receiving the Word of God. And then, lastly, at the end of Genesis chapter 5, in the world, the jungle has escalated to now a global condition, a problem. There's one who's going to emerge, and his name is Noah. And we'll see what happens next week on that. So, I want to reread the text now. This is all from this text. But I want to reread it now within the light of what I've showed you. Starting at verse 6, there came a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, my parentheses here. Yes, John is unique in his role. John is definitely unique in his role in history. He's playing a role that was prophesied in Isaiah 500 years before. But yet he is similar to those who have come before him, those who have received the Word. So he's dissimilar and he's similar. His role is very unique in history, but yet he is one who has received the Word. He came as a witness to testify about the light, that all might believe through him. He was not the light. There was confusion about who John was. And we're going to see that in the text. It doesn't take a really technical reading to see that. People are confused. Who is John? What is his role in history? And so John the Apostle, the author, clarifies that. He's not the light, but he's there to bear witness of the light and testify about the light. There was the true light. There always has been the true light. And that true light is the Word. The Word has always been. And that Word has come into the world, and that light has always been the entity that enlightens every man. There is no other. And examples of that is Enosh, Enoch, and Noah. He, the Word, was in the world, and the world was made through him, as we read in John, the first opening verse of the prologue. And the world did not know him because he couldn't grasp it. The world, the light cannot, the darkness cannot grasp the light. And so the light is there, but the world can't grasp it. It doesn't know it. Even so, more so, the light, the word came. Let's see. He came to his own. The created aspect of, the word came as the light of men. And they couldn't grasp it. And so he came to his own, and his own did not receive him, the word. But as many as did receive him, Enoch, Noah, and many others who are not recorded, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And these were born not of blood, natural birth, I guess you could say, nor of the will of the flesh by want to and desire and motivation, but these were born of God. So, summary. Where we are thus far, verses 1 through 13. This is where we've come in 3 weeks. Number 1, it is the second darkness that creates the human condition of separation. The Bible calls that separation death. That's in Genesis 3. Number 2, this growing separation escalates, resulting in a global condition called the dark jungle, as we've shown at the end of chapter 5. It is a global problem. The Word is present and continues to speak into this globally dark jungle. Everett was talking about the grace of God. Guys, the grace of God existed prior to Jesus Christ. The grace of God has always been. From within the jungle, some, like John, have received the Word and thus have borne witness to the Word. So John is similar. He follows in the footsteps of the Enoch, and the Noah. But John is also, John, though similar, is also unique in the role that he plays in history. He's the one who will announce and bear witness that something dramatically new is about to happen. And thus, John the Apostle is setting the stage for his gospel. We'll continue next week. Well, thank you guys. That
Thank you, Mark.
over.